delve into the incredible story of Moses, the leadership guided by God, the miracles and the humility of a man who, even in the face of so many trials, trusted in the divine plan. If you've ever felt called to something great, even without feeling ready, this story will inspire you. Let's discover together the power of faith and obedience amid challenges. Subscribe to the channel for more exciting biblical stories and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any videos. If you like the content, don't forget to send a thanks a lot. And if you want to support the channel even more, become a member and gain access to exclusive benefits. Moses was in a peaceful phase of life. Far from the palaces of Egypt, he lived as a shepherd in the lands of Midian, taking care of the flock of his father-in-law, Jethro. Day after day, he roamed the desert, guiding the sheep, surveying the vast, silent horizon. The solitude of the desert seemed to welcome Moses, who, over time, became accustomed to this simple and peaceful routine. Nothing indicated that anything different could happen that day, until his eyes caught something unusual. In front of him, a bush was burning. The fire danced on its leaves and branches, but, strangely, the bush was not consumed. Moses, intrigued, approached to understand what was happening. It was a fascinating sight. The flame was there, alive, but the bush remained intact. The silence of the desert seemed to intensify at that moment, and Moses took a few more steps, when, suddenly, a voice called his name. "Moses, Moses," said the voice, like an echo that reverberated in your heart. Moses stopped, surprised. Who could be talking to him in the middle of the desert? And then, the voice introduced itself. It was God. That moment would transform Moses' life forever. God called him to a great mission, to free the Hebrew people from slavery in Egypt. However, before he could react, he already felt a disturbing doubt within him, a question that echoed in his thoughts. How could I, a simple shepherd, face the Pharaoh? Moses was paralyzed before God's call. The voice that echoed in his ears still seemed distant, even though the words were clear. Free the Hebrew people? He, a simple man, accustomed to herding in the silence of the desert, would now have to stand before the powerful Pharaoh. Insecurity took over his heart, and an avalanche of doubts fell upon him. "Who am I to do this?" Moses muttered, almost without realizing he was speaking out loud. He tried to imagine the scene, a man alone, with nothing but a staff in his hands, facing the most powerful ruler of the time. Moses knew Egypt, had lived among its palaces and seen its splendor and oppression up close. He knew how inflexible Pharaoh was, and the idea of convincing a tyrant like that to free the Hebrews seemed impossible. How could someone like him accomplish such a task? Moses did not think he was capable. As these thoughts raced through his mind, God's voice interrupted him again, this time firm but full of patience. God assured him that he would not be alone on this journey. He promised to be at Moses' side, guiding his every step. But even so, Moses felt a knot in his stomach. Would it be enough? His humility prevented him from seeing what God already saw in him. He was not a great speaker, had no influence and no power. And even with the divine promises, there was still something that made him hesitate. How would he convince others that this calling was real? Moses was still lost in his doubts when God, with a firm voice, interrupted him once again. "What do you have in your hands?" he asked. Moses looked down and saw the object that accompanied him every day in the desert, his staff. It was a simple tool, made of rustic wood, nothing more than a stick with which he guided the sheep. "A staff," he replied. God then ordered him to throw the staff to the ground. Hesitantly, Moses obeyed. As soon as the staff touched the barren land, something extraordinary happened. In the blink of an eye, the staff transformed into a living serpent. Moses jumped back, his heart racing, fright evident in his eyes. The serpent moved over the rocks of the desert, and for a moment he wondered if it was all real. The voice of God, however, left no room for doubt. "Reach out and grab her by the tail." Moses hesitated for a moment. Catch a snake by the tail? This could be dangerous. But, with his heart racing and his eyes fixed on the ground, he gathered his courage and did as he was asked. The moment his fingers touched the serpent's tail, it returned to being the simple staff it had always been. The common object, which he carried every day, now became proof that God was with him and would make the impossible happen. With the staff now transformed into a symbol of God's power, Moses knew that his next step would be the most difficult yet, facing the Pharaoh. The task seemed gigantic. Upon arriving in Egypt, he met his brother Aaron, who would help him take God's message to the powerful king. Together, the two headed to the imposing palace, where the Pharaoh ruled with an iron fist. Moses' heart was beating fast. He knew he was about to start a battle not just against Pharaoh, but against an entire system of oppression. Before the Pharaoh, the grandeur of the Egyptian court contrasted with the simplicity of Moses. With his staff in his hands, he, an exile, pastor and now spokesman for God, dared to say, "Let my people go." The words reverberated across the hall. But Pharaoh, sitting on his throne, just laughed scornfully. Who was Moses to demand something like that? Pharaoh's gaze hardened, and he denied the request. His heart, heavy as a stone, was determined not to free the Hebrews. Moses knew it wouldn't be easy. At that moment, God had told Moses that Pharaoh's heart would be hardened. It was a battle that would require more than words. Moses' staff became more than a symbol. It was a harbinger of what was to come. When Moses threw the staff to the ground and it turned back into a serpent, Pharaoh called his magicians, who also performed similar tricks. But Moses' serpent swallowed the others, a clear sign that God's power was greater. Even so, the Pharaoh remained unyielding. Moses' words, although firm, were not enough to break the ruler's will. Pharaoh's resistance did not go unanswered. Moses, guided by God, knew that the time for patience was over and that now Egypt would face consequences never seen before. The first sign of divine power came silently when Moses raised his staff over the waters of the Nile. The river, which was the source of life for all of Egypt, turned to blood. The strong smell and deep red of the waters heralded the beginning of a series of disasters that shook the foundations of the empire. The fish began to die, the river became undrinkable, and chaos spread throughout the country. The people ran in despair, looking for drinking water, while the Pharaoh, stubborn as always, closed his eyes to the disaster. He believed it was all just another trick. His wizards tried to replicate the feat, but the damage was already done. Egypt, dependent on the Nile, began to feel the weight of divine justice. But Pharaoh still did not bow. God then sent more signs, increasingly severe. Fleets of frogs came out of the river, invading houses and palaces, covering everything they passed. And when the frogs left, swarms of mosquitoes came and, later, swarms of flies, which turned the lives of the Egyptians into a true nightmare. Each new plague was a true blow, showing that God's power could not be ignored. However, Pharaoh's heart remained hardened. Chaos took over Egypt. The plagues followed one after another, as if the sky itself were collapsing on the people. Every time Pharaoh refused to free the Hebrews, something worse happened. Even so, his heart remained closed, insensitive to suffering. But the worst of the plagues was yet to come, and Moses knew it would be devastating. God had given him precise instructions for the Hebrew people, something that would deeply mark that moment in history, Easter. On that dark night, the Hebrews were ordered to sacrifice a pure, flawless lamb. The blood of this lamb should be smeared at the entrances to the doors of their homes. It was a sign, a foreshadowing that something terrible was about to happen, but that God would protect his people. As the Hebrews followed the instructions, an uneasy silence hung in the air. The stars in the sky seemed to watch, like silent witnesses of what was about to happen. And then, it happened. During the early hours of the morning, a deep lament echoed through the streets of Egypt. The houses that did not have the sign of blood were hit by unimaginable pain. The death of all the firstborn children. From the palace to the simplest hut, no one was spared. The crying of the Egyptians was mixed with despair, and for the first time, the Pharaoh, broken by grief, called Moses. It was impossible to ignore what had happened. Pharaoh finally gave in. "Go and take your people," he ordered. Moses and the Hebrews prepared to leave, leaving behind centuries of slavery and suffering. The people hurriedly organized themselves, gathering their families, taking their possessions and taking with them not only objects, but also the weight of the hope of a new life. Egypt, which once seemed like a forced home, now stayed behind as a symbol of the oppression they were leaving. And so, guided by Moses, an immense crowd began to walk towards the unknown. It was the beginning of a long journey, with the promised land on the distant horizon. However, the feeling of newfound freedom was soon mixed with a certain anxiety. The desert was vast, doubts began to grow, and everyone's physical and emotional resistance would be tested. Ahead of everyone, Moses walked firmly, confident that he was being guided by God. The people, although exhausted, continued. However, something unexpected happened. The Pharaoh, embittered by the loss and filled with growing anger, reversed his decision. He could not accept that those slaves, who had worked for him for so long, simply disappeared. In an impulse of revenge, the Pharaoh gathered his army, with its powerful war chariots, and set out in pursuit of the people of Israel. As the Hebrews advanced, Moses began to sense danger approaching. Panic began to take over the people. The waters of the Red Sea glittered ahead, vast and impassable. Behind, the sound of Egyptian chariots approached quickly. The ground shook under the weight of horses and warriors. The despair of the Hebrews was palpable. Shouts and murmurs echoed through the air as many turned against Moses, questioning why he had taken them to that place. They were trapped, and death seemed certain. Moses, however, even feeling the weight of responsibility, raised his eyes to the sky. He knew that God did not bring them there to perish. With his staff in his hands, Moses approached the edge of the sea, feeling the cold wind on his face. And then, in an act of faith, he extended his staff over the waters. What happened next was something no one could have imagined. The sea, in a surprising movement, began to part. The waters rose, forming liquid walls on both sides, revealing a dry path in the middle of what was once an impassable barrier. The wind was blowing strong, as if blowing directly from the heavens, pushing the waters away. The impossible had become reality before his eyes. The astonished Hebrews watched the vision for a few moments, but there was no time for hesitation. With Moses at the head, the people began to cross the sea, their eyes wide with amazement and their hearts pulsing with fear and hope. The sound of the strong wind that kept the waters at bay mixed with the incessant murmur of the waves, which rose like high walls on each side. Every step on the land previously covered by the sea was a journey between the impossible and the miracle. However, the danger was not yet completely eliminated. The Egyptian army, led by an angry Pharaoh, was not intimidated when they saw the path open in the waters. The carriages began to descend on the same trail. The Hebrews advanced as fast as they could, but they knew that the Egyptians were close behind. The sound of carriage wheels and the heavy trotting of horses echoed, a constant reminder that the enemy was still in pursuit. Moses looked back, noticing the tension growing in the people. The fear of being overtaken before reaching the other side squeezed their hearts. But he continued walking with confidence, knowing that the same hand that parted the sea was still upon them. When the last of the Hebrews reached the other bank, Moses, with a determined look, once again raised his staff. Then, the waters that had stood firm, like guardians of the sides of the path, began to collapse. The sea, which had been divided, now closed in on the Egyptians who were following the same path. The sound of carriages and horses was replaced by the roar of the waters returning to their place. The people watched, unable to look away. The sea had closed behind them, and the people of Israel were now finally free from Pharaoh's persecution. However, the euphoria of victory soon gave way to a new reality, the desert. As they advanced, the scorching sun and endless vastness began to weigh on the Hebrews. The freedom they so longed for was now accompanied by uncertainty. As the days went by, fatigue grew, and hunger and thirst became even greater challenges. The desert seemed merciless, and the people began to murmur. Moses, once again, felt the weight of leadership. He knew that even though they had escaped slavery in Egypt, the journey to the promised land would be long and full of trials. The people looked at him suspiciously, questioning whether they had really been freed to starve in the desert. It was a test of faith, both for Moses and the Hebrews. And, once again, Moses turned to God for guidance. Then, one morning, something unexpected happened. When the people emerged from their tents, they found the ground covered in an unknown substance. It was thin and white, something never seen before. The Hebrews looked at each other, confused, and asked, "What is this?" Moses, with a calm look, explained that this was manna, the bread that God had sent from the heavens to sustain them. Each family should harvest enough for the day, nothing more, because God will check again the next morning. And so, daily, the manna fell, as a constant reminder that God was with them. The manna sustained the people, but the desert, with its relentless aridity, brought a new challenge: thirst. Crossing those arid lands, the heat made every drop of sweat weigh like a load. Sources of water were rare, and soon the murmur that had previously arisen because of hunger was now intensified by thirst. The people began to lose hope, questioning why God had taken them out of Egypt only to leave them at the mercy of so many difficulties. Some even began to remember the times of slavery with nostalgia, because, despite being oppressed, at least they had water and food. Moses felt the pressure increasing. He saw the exhausted faces of the people, heard their complaints, and, once again, turned to God, seeking a solution. Then, God gave him a new instruction. Moses should take the staff, the same one that had opened the Red Sea, and go to a rock. Faced with the people's disbelief, he should hit the rock with his staff, and God would make him whether water gushed out. With determination, Moses followed God's orders. Arriving in front of the rock, surrounded by the Hebrews, he raised his staff and struck the stone. The dry sound of impact echoed, and in an instant, the rock split open, and cool water began to flow abundantly. The people, relieved and in disbelief, ran to quench their thirst. That water, springing from such an unlikely place, was a clear sign that, even in the desert, God cared for them in unexpected ways. The people of Israel had seen God work in miraculous ways in the desert, but they still did not fully understand what it meant to be the chosen people. Moses, leading that crowd, knew that more than physical freedom, they needed a purpose, a clear direction, and it was at the foot of an imposing mountain, Mount Sinai, that something extraordinary happened. The mountain rose majestically on the horizon, its slopes covered by dense, dark clouds. The sky began to thunder, and lightning ripped across the sky, as if nature itself was revering the moment. God called Moses to climb the mountain, where he would receive a revelation that would guide not only those people, but future generations. The people, at the foot of the mountain, looked on with fear and respect. They knew something great was about to happen, but they had no idea the magnitude of what was about to be delivered. Moses climbed the mountain and, there, amidst thunder and fire, God gave him the tablets of the 10 Commandments.